Welcome to the Scary Mister. I know, many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video story. Have you ever been so sure that someone or something was watching you that you couldn't ignore it? That you could feel its gaze prickling at your skin, the hairs on the back of your neck standing on end? Maybe you brushed it off, telling yourself it was just paranoia or the tricks of an overactive mind. That's what I used to do until the week that changed my life. I had agreed to house sit for my aunt. Her home was a sprawling Victorian mansion surrounded by dense forest. It was the kind of place that belonged in a painting or a horror movie. What I thought would be a relaxing, quiet week turned into the most harrowing experience of my life. What I experienced in that house, what I survived, still keeps me awake at night. Maybe by telling this story, I can finally exorcise it from my mind. But I need you to listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story, it's a warning. The driveway to my aunt's house was long, winding, and flanked by towering pines. As I pulled up in my little hatchback, the house loomed into view. An elegant yet eerie structure with steep gables and large windows that seemed to watch me. It was the kind of house that had character, layers of history etched into its walls, floors, and ceilings. My Aunt Lydia greeted me warmly. She was in her late 50s with a sharp wit and a penchant for travel. She loved the house, claiming it had a soul. "I've always felt safe here," she said, handing me the keys. "But it does have its quirks. The floorboards creak, the pipes groan, and the wind plays tricks with the windows. Don't let it spook you." I laughed and promised I'd take good care of the place. She left early the next morning, her taxi rumbling down the graveled drive. I stood in the doorway, feeling a strange mix of excitement and trepidation as the sound of her car faded into silence. I was alone now. That first night, I explored the house. It had 3 floors, each one filled with antique furniture, faded portraits, and shelves of dusty books. The dining room had a massive oak table that looked like it belonged in a castle, and the parlor was filled with mismatched armchairs that felt like they held secrets. The kitchen was cozy, though, with its vintage stove and bright yellow curtains. I made myself dinner and sat down with a book in the living room. The silence was almost oppressive. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see something or someone peering in. But there was nothing, just darkness. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head upstairs. The guest room was warm and inviting, with a bed that felt like it was made for royalty. As I settled in, I felt a small pang of unease. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the wind whistled through the eaves, or how the shadows seemed to stretch across the room. The next morning, I woke up early to sunlight streaming through the lace curtains. I felt refreshed, dismissing my nervousness from the night before. The day was uneventful. I spent most of it unpacking, reading, and taking a walk around the property. The woods behind the house were dense and quiet. The kind of place where you'd expect to find fairies or ghosts. I wandered for a while, enjoying the crisp autumn air, before heading back to the house. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, almost suffocating. I tried watching TV in the parlor, but the static on the old set was unnerving. I turned it off and headed to bed. That's when I heard it, a faint creak like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. It came from the hallway outside my room. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was just the house settling. But then the creak came again, louder this time, and again. Footsteps, deliberate, slow, and unmistakable. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The hallway was empty, but the air felt charged, like something was watching me from the shadows. By the third day, the unease had taken root. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow sinister. I started to notice small, strange things. The pantry door was slightly ajar when I was sure I'd closed it. A chair in the dining room had been pulled out from the table. And then there was the window in the living room. It was unlocked. I distinctly remembered locking it the day before. That night, I barricaded myself in the guest room. I told myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew better. At 2 a.m., I woke to a soft tapping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and coming from the window. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to stay under the covers. But curiosity won out. When I peeked out from behind the curtain, my blood turned to ice. There, pressed against the glass, was a pale, distorted face. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. By the time I turned back to the window, it was gone. The next morning, I was shaken, but determined to make sense of what I had seen. I wasn't sure if it was a hallucination from lack of sleep, or if something truly sinister was happening. Either way, I needed answers. I decided to call my Aunt Lydia, but my phone kept losing signal. Frustrated, I rummaged through the kitchen drawers for the landline phone she mentioned before she left. While searching, I stumbled upon an old leather-bound journal tucked away in the back of a cabinet. The journal wasn't marked, but it had a faint smell of lavender, like Lydia's perfume. I sat down at the dining room table and flipped through its pages. The handwriting was hers, slanted and neat. But the entries weren't what I expected. They weren't about her travels or the house's upkeep. They were about the house itself. March 3rd, the whispers have returned. They come mostly at night, soft and fleeting, like someone just out of earshot. I can't make out the words, but I know they're not friendly. May 17th, I saw it again today, standing in the woods near the old well. The same pale figure watching me. Its face, I can't describe it. I don't think it was human. June 22nd, it was inside the house last night. I heard the footsteps in the hall, felt its presence outside my door. I'm starting to think it's tied to the land, not just the house. Maybe I've made a mistake staying here so long. The entries sent chills down my spine. My aunt calm, rational Aunt Lydia had been experiencing the same horrors I was, and she'd never told me. That evening, I decided to venture into the woods behind the house. If the figure Lydia mentioned was connected to the land, maybe I could find clues out there. Armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, I headed out as the sun dipped below the horizon. The woods were unnervingly silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. I followed the narrow path until I reached an old, moss-covered well Lydia had mentioned in her journal. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The bricks were crumbling, and vines had snaked their way around the base. As I approached, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was colder here, heavy and damp. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper. It wasn't coming from the well, it was coming from the trees. I spun around, and for a brief moment, my light caught something. A figure. Tall, thin, and unnaturally pale. It stood between two trees, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I screamed and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks until I burst out of the woods and back into the yard. I didn't stop running until I was inside the house with every door locked and bolted. After a sleepless night, I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. There had to be something I was missing, something that could explain what was happening. I combed through the attic, the basement, and even Lydia's bedroom. That's when I noticed it. A door at the end of the second-floor hallway. It was slightly hidden behind an old armoire, almost like someone didn't want it to be found. The door was locked, but I remembered seeing a ring of keys in the kitchen. It took a while to find the right one, but when the lock clicked open, I felt a wave of dread. The room beyond was small and windowless, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. In the center of the room was an old trunk. Inside, I found photos, black and white images of people standing in front of the house. But in every photo, there was something wrong. A figure stood in the background, barely noticeable at first. It was the same pale figure I'd seen in the woods and at the window. Beneath the photos was a bundle of letters. They were addressed to Lydia from someone named Eleanor, who I later learned was the house's previous owner. The letters detailed her descent into paranoia, claiming she was being hunted by a watcher tied to the property. Eleanor's letters. I hear it at night, pacing outside my bedroom. It never enters, but I know it's there, waiting, watching. I tried to leave once, but it followed me. It's tied to me now, a shadow I can't escape. If you ever find this, Lydia, promise me you'll leave. This house isn't safe, not for anyone. That night, the power went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from my flashlight. I tried calling for help again, but the landline was dead, and my cell phone had no signal. As I fumbled around the house, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they weren't slow or deliberate. They were running. The sound echoed through the halls, coming closer and closer. I locked myself in the guest room, clutching the knife and praying it would stop. But then I heard a new sound, scratching. Something was clawing at the door, accompanied by that same guttural whisper. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, its tone mocking and cruel. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse. Desperate and exhausted, I decided to confront the entity head on. I took the journal, the photos, and the letters, hoping they might hold a clue. I returned to the woods, this time in daylight. As I neared the well, the air grew colder again. The figure appeared, but it didn't stay in the shadows this time. It stepped forward, its movements unnatural, like a marionette on strings. It spoke, its voice a cacophony of whispers. "You are not welcome here." I demanded to know what it wanted, but it only laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. The wind picked up, swirling leaves around me. I felt something pulling me toward the well, a force I couldn't resist. The force pulling me toward the well was overwhelming. My feet slid across the damp earth as if the ground itself was moving beneath me. The air around the well felt charged, crackling with an unseen energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I fought against it, planting my heels into the ground, but it was no use. The figure loomed closer, its face an unreadable void. Its presence bore down on me, and for the first time in my life, I felt utterly powerless. In a final desperate attempt, I screamed, "What do you want from me?" My voice echoed through the woods, but the figure didn't answer. Instead, the whispers grew louder, surrounding me, drowning out my thoughts. The edge of the well was only inches away when the pull suddenly stopped. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Gathering my strength, I leaned over the edge of the well and shone my flashlight inside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a series of crude carvings on the inner walls. They were symbols, ancient, jagged, and utterly alien. My stomach churned as I recognized one of the symbols from Lydia's journal. And then I saw it. At the bottom of the well, something moved. It wasn't human. Its body was a mass of shadow and bone, its elongated limbs clawing at the stone walls as if trying to climb up. Its head tilted upward, and for a moment, our eyes met, if they could even be called eyes. They glowed a sickly yellow, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though it was peering directly into my soul. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance. The ground around the well began to tremble, and a low guttural roar erupted from the depths. Whatever was down there wasn't content to stay confined any longer. I ran back to the house, clutching the journal and letters. The symbols had to mean something I could use to stop this. I spread the papers out on the dining table, scanning each page for answers. Finally, I found it. One of Eleanor's letters mentioned a ritual, a way to seal the presence within the land. But the instructions were vague, fragmented, as though she had been too afraid to write them down in full. All I knew was that it involved the well, the carvings, and some kind of offering. As night fell, the atmosphere in the house grew oppressive. The air was thick and heavy, and every creak of the floorboard sent my heart racing. The lights flickered, and the whispers returned, this time louder, angrier. I barricaded myself in the living room, clutching the knife and a flashlight. But the whispers didn't stay outside. They were inside, surrounding me. Shadows danced along the walls, moving in ways that defied the light. Then the figure appeared in the corner of the room. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. My breath caught in my throat as it raised one elongated hand and pointed directly at me. "You cannot save this place," it hissed, its voice a cacophony of anguish. "You cannot save yourself." Terrified but resolute, I knew I had to act. I gathered everything I thought I might need: a bag of salt, matches, candles, and the journal. Lydia had always kept a stash of sage in the kitchen, and I grabbed that too, hoping it would offer some protection. The instructions in Eleanor's letter mentioned fire and the well. I could only hope that meant burning the sage and using the candles to seal whatever was lurking beneath the surface. I returned to the woods under the cover of darkness. The path to the well felt longer this time, the trees closing in around me like a living wall. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. When I reached the well, the air was freezing. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost clung to the grass despite the summer heat. I set up the candles in a circle around the well, sprinkling the salt as I went. The sage was lit, its smoke curling into the night air. The entity was waiting. Its form materialized from the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "You think this will stop me?" it growled, its voice shaking the ground beneath my feet. "You are nothing." I ignored its taunts and began reciting the words from the journal. The symbols on the well began to glow faintly, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. The entity screamed, a sound that pierced the night and sent a flock of birds scattering into the sky. As I continued the ritual, the ground began to shake violently. The well emitted a deep, resonant hum, and the carvings on its surface glowed brighter. The entity lashed out, its shadowy limbs clawing at the air around me. One swipe sent me sprawling, but I clung to the journal and resumed the chant. The final step required an offering. Eleanor's letter had been vague, but I understood the intent. It had to be something personal, something meaningful. I tore a pendant from around my neck, a gift from Lydia when I was a child, and threw it into the well. The effect was immediate. A blinding light erupted from the well, consuming the shadows and the entity with it. The figure let out a final, anguished scream before it dissolved into nothingness. The woods fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by an almost eerie calm. I stood there, trembling, staring into the now empty well. Whatever had been lurking there was gone, or at least I hoped it was. When I returned to the house, it felt different. The whispers were gone. The shadows no longer moved on their own. For the first time in days, I felt safe. Lydia returned the next day to find me exhausted but alive. I showed her the journal and the letters, and she confessed that she had known about the house's dark history, but had hoped it wouldn't affect me. We decided to sell the property and never speak of it again. To this day, I still don't fully understand what happened during those 6 days. Was it a haunting? A curse? Something tied to the land itself? All I know is that it was real, and it left scars I'll carry for the rest of my life. If you're ever alone in a strange house and feel like something isn't right, trust your instincts. Some places are just wrong, and some things aren't meant to be understood. Hey everyone, before I dive into this story, I need to warn you, this isn't your typical urban legend or campfire tale. What I'm about to share is real. It happened to me, and it's haunted me ever since. Even now, years later, I can still hear the whispers and feel the cold touch of the place that almost claimed me. This story is about an abandoned asylum, one hidden deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. I went there on a dare, thinking it would be just another creepy adventure to laugh about later. But I didn't leave the same person who entered. It was late fall 2014. I was 20, a junior in college, and always up for a thrill. My friends and I were an adventurous bunch, constantly looking for abandoned places to explore. One night, over beers and bad takeout, my buddy Mark mentioned an asylum he'd heard about, a sprawling complex hidden in the woods about 2 hours from campus. "People say it's haunted," Mark said, leaning in like he was sharing a dark secret. "Patients disappeared there. Staff, too. The place shut down in the 70s, and no one's been back since." Of course, that was all the encouragement I needed. By the end of the night, we had a plan. We'd head to the asylum the following weekend and explore it for ourselves. The drive to the asylum was uneventful, at least at first. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind where the sunlight filters through the trees in golden beams. Mark, his girlfriend Rachel, our mutual friend Sarah, and I piled into Mark's beat-up SUV and hit the road. The GPS led us to a narrow, overgrown dirt road about 5 miles off the highway. As we turned onto it, the atmosphere began to change. The vibrant colors of fall seemed to fade, replaced by a gray, oppressive gloom. The road twisted and turned, hemmed in by dense trees that blocked out most of the light. After what felt like hours, the asylum came into view. It was massive. Several buildings connected by long, covered walkways, their windows shattered and walls streaked with graffiti. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. We parked the car in a small clearing and made our way toward the main building. The front doors were ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the faint metallic smell of rust and decay. The first floor was eerily quiet. Peeling paint hung from the walls, and broken furniture was scattered everywhere. A wheelchair sat in the middle of a hallway, its wheels rusted and locked in place. "This is so cliché," Sarah muttered, her voice echoing in the emptiness. But I felt it right away, that oppressive weight, like the air itself was watching us. We split up to explore, promising to regroup in the lobby in an hour. I paired up with Sarah, while Mark and Rachel went off in another direction. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. At first, I thought it was Sarah muttering under her breath. But when I turned to ask what she'd said, her face went pale. "I thought that was you," she whispered. The sound grew louder as we moved deeper into the building. A soft, indistinct murmuring that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My pulse quickened, but I pushed the fear down. "Just the wind," I said, trying to convince both of us. When we regrouped in the lobby, Mark and Rachel looked shaken. "You won't believe what we found," Mark said, holding up a crumpled, yellowed folder. "Patient records. They're all still here." The folder contained handwritten notes, photos, and charts. Most of it was mundane, medical histories, treatment plans. But one name kept appearing, Margaret Blackwell. She'd been a patient at the asylum for nearly 20 years, according to the records. But what stood out was the last entry. Transferred to the basement for further observation. Case unresolved. "The basement?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "We have to check it out," Mark said, already heading toward a staircase. The basement was worse than the rest of the asylum. The air was colder, thicker, and the whispers were louder. They seemed to echo off the walls, forming words just out of reach. As we descended, our flashlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows. The stairs ended in a heavy metal door. It was slightly ajar, revealing a dark hallway lined with cells. Inside one of the cells, we found a chair bolted to the floor, its leather restraints still intact. The walls were covered in scratches, desperate, frantic marks that spelled out words in a language none of us recognized. "This is messed up," Sarah said, her voice shaking. As we moved deeper into the basement, the whispers grew deafening, and then they stopped. The silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making your heartbeat sound like a drum. That's when we saw her. At the end of the hallway, a woman stood, her back to us. She was wearing a hospital gown, her hair long and matted. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice cracking. She didn't move. "Maybe we should go," Rachel whispered. But before we could, the woman turned around. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin. She raised a hand, pointing at us, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. We ran. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the metal door growing smaller and smaller in the distance. Behind us, the whispers turned into screams. When we finally burst through the door and back into the stairwell, the building seemed alive. Doors slammed, shadows darted across the walls, and the air was thick with the sound of laughter. Maniacal, inhuman laughter. We never spoke about what happened that night. Mark burned the patient records, and we all agreed never to return to the asylum. But even now, years later, I can't forget the woman in the basement, or the whispers that still haunt my dreams. After that night, nothing was the same. Even though we escaped the asylum, it felt like we had left a part of ourselves behind and brought something else with us. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows in the corners of my room seemed darker, denser, as if they had weight. The whispers didn't stop either. Late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I'd hear them again. Soft, murmuring voices that seemed to come from inside my own mind. Mark, Rachel, and Sarah weren't faring any better. Mark stopped answering his phone. Rachel refused to leave her apartment, and Sarah withdrew from our group entirely. One night, about 2 weeks after the asylum visit, I woke up at 3:33 a.m., the exact same time we first heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just another bad dream, but then I noticed something odd. My bedroom door, which I always kept closed, was slightly ajar. I sat up, my heart racing. That's when I saw it. A faint figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was barely visible, like a smudge of darkness against the already dim room. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. But the whispers began again, soft and almost melodic, like a lullaby sung in reverse. I must have screamed, because the next thing I knew, my roommate was shaking me awake. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, I called Sarah. She sounded exhausted, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't slept in days. "I keep seeing her," she admitted. "That woman from the asylum, she's in my dreams, in the mirror, everywhere." Mark and Rachel were experiencing similar things. Rachel's boyfriend had moved in temporarily because she was too afraid to be alone, and Mark confessed that he'd started sleeping with all the lights on. "It's like she followed us," Mark said. "Or maybe we brought her back." Desperate for answers, I decided to dig deeper into the history of the asylum. The local library had a small section on urban legends, and I found an old newspaper article about Margaret Blackwell, the woman whose name we had seen in the patient records. According to the article, Margaret had been institutionalized for severe psychosis, but the staff suspected something more sinister. She claimed to be possessed by an entity she called the Whisperer. The article described how Margaret's condition deteriorated after being moved to the basement. Staff reported hearing strange noises and seeing shadows that moved on their own. Then, one night, Margaret vanished. The official story was that she escaped, but the article hinted at something darker. She didn't escape, the article read. She became part of the asylum. I shared what I found with Mark, Rachel, and Sarah. The asylum wasn't just a place, it was a trap. And Margaret, or whatever she had become, was its keeper. "We have to go back," Sarah said, surprising all of us. "Are you insane?" Rachel snapped. But Sarah was right. Whatever we had unleashed, it wasn't going to stop. If we wanted our lives back, we had to face it. A month to the day after our first visit, we found ourselves standing in front of the asylum again. This time, the atmosphere was even worse. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the whispers began the moment we stepped inside. Armed with flashlights, salt, and a makeshift plan, we made our way back to the basement. The moment we entered, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging the room into darkness. Our flashlights flickered, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping, until they became a deafening roar. Margaret was waiting for us. She stood in the center of the room, her empty eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice layered with dozens of others. "We didn't mean to disturb you," Mark said, his voice trembling. Margaret smiled, a cold, joyless grin. "It's too late. You belong to me now." The room erupted into chaos. Shadows swirled around us and the walls seemed to close in. The whispers became screams, and Margaret began to advance. In a moment of desperation, Sarah threw the salt at Margaret. The moment it touched her, she shrieked and recoiled, her form flickering like a dying light. "Keep going!" I yelled, grabbing the rest of the salt and tossing it at the shadows. Rachel pulled out a small jar of holy water she had brought and splashed it on the ground. The air seemed to vibrate, and Margaret let out an ear-piercing scream. "You can't stop me!" she hissed, her form dissolving into the darkness. "This place is mine!" With one final burst of light, the room went silent. We left the asylum that night, bruised, shaken, but alive. The whispers stopped, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The asylum was demolished a year later, but I've never forgotten what happened there. So, if you ever hear whispers in the dark or feel like you're being watched, don't ignore it. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and the things we uncover are better left alone. Though we thought we had ended whatever malevolent force lingered in the asylum, the feeling of unease followed us like a shadow. At first, it was subtle. Odd dreams, fleeting movements in our peripheral vision, and the occasional cold spot in our homes. But soon, the remnants of Margaret, or the Whisperer, began to manifest more overtly. It started with Rachel. A week after our return, she called me late at night, her voice shaky and uneven. "She's here," Rachel whispered. "What do you mean she's there?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "I don't know how, but I can feel her." I woke up and saw her standing at the foot of my bed. She just stood there staring at me. I tried to move, but I couldn't. The sound of Rachel's breathing quickened on the phone. It wasn't sleep paralysis. I could hear her whispers, her voice, like it was inside my head. Rachel's boyfriend, who had been staying with her, confirmed that he heard the whispers too. He woke up to Rachel sitting upright, staring blankly at the corner of the room. Mark's experience took a darker turn. Always skeptical, he dismissed the whispers and shadows as tricks of the mind. But as the days passed, he became consumed with researching the asylum, the patients, and Margaret Blackwell's history. He started sending us frantic messages about the Whisperer. "She wasn't just a patient," he said during one of our calls. "She was part of something much bigger, a cult. They called themselves the Silent Choir. They believed in summoning an ancient entity that would grant them eternal life in exchange for servitude. Margaret was the final offering before the asylum shut down." Mark's voice grew frantic. "But they failed. She became the vessel, and the asylum became her prison. When we disturbed her, we didn't just awaken a ghost. We broke a seal." The paranoia in his voice was unmistakable. He spoke of symbols etched into the asylum walls, of shadows moving in impossible patterns. A few days later, Mark stopped responding entirely. Sarah, who had been the most rational among us, started to change as well. Her once bubbly personality became distant and cold. She refused to talk about the asylum, insisting that we move on, but there was something in her eyes, a haunted look that spoke of sleepless nights and unseen horrors. Then one night, She sent us a cryptic message. I hear her voice. She's calling me back. I don't think I can resist. We tried to contact her, but it was too late. Sarah disappeared without a trace. Her apartment was left untouched, her belongings exactly as they had been. The only thing out of place was a single word scratched into the surface of her bedroom mirror. Come. Rachel and I were terrified. Mark was unreachable. Sarah was gone. And now it felt like the asylum's curse was closing in on us. One night, I woke to find my phone vibrating on my nightstand. The screen glowed with an unknown number. Hesitating, I answered. At first, there was only static, but then a familiar voice broke through. Come back, it whispered. It was Sarah's voice, but distorted, layered with a dozen others. She's waiting for you. I hung up, my hands trembling. The call log showed no record of the call. A week later, Rachel and I managed to track down Mark. He was holed up in his parents' old cabin, surrounded by piles of papers, maps, and old photos of the asylum. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. She's not done with us, Mark said without preamble. Margaret, or whatever she is, needs us to finish what her cult started. She's trying to bring the entity into our world, and we're the key. He spread out a series of old documents. They detailed rituals performed by the silent choir, with Margaret's name listed as the anchor. According to the text, anyone who disrupted the asylum's sanctity would become part of the ritual. She's marked us, Mark said. That's why we're all experiencing this. If we don't stop her, she'll consume us and bring something far worse into our world. With no other option, we decided to return to the asylum one last time. Armed with Mark's research, Rachel and I joined him at the crumbling remains of the building. The asylum had changed. The air was heavier, the darkness more oppressive. It felt alive, pulsating with an energy that set every nerve on edge. Inside, the walls were covered in new symbols, intricate markings that hadn't been there before. They glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. As we descended into the basement, the whispers grew louder. This time, they weren't disembodied. They were accompanied by figures. Shadowy forms materialized around us, their faces obscured, but their presence unmistakable. They formed a circle, their voices blending into a chilling chant. At the center stood Margaret, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You came back," she said, her voice reverberating with malice. "Good. The ritual can now be completed." Mark shouted something in Latin, throwing salt and holy water into the circle. The figures recoiled, their forms flickering like static on a screen. Margaret screamed, her voice splitting into a cacophony of wails. The room began to shake, the walls cracking as the ground beneath us opened. A blinding light erupted from the circle, and the shadows lunged at us. Rachel and I held on to each other, reciting the incantations Mark had written down. The light grew brighter, consuming Margaret and the shadowy figures. With one final deafening scream, the asylum collapsed into silence. We barely escaped the ruins. Covered in dust and shaken to our cores, we watched as the asylum finally crumbled, taking Margaret and the silent choir with it. The whispers stopped. The shadows disappeared. And for the first time in weeks, I felt free. But even now, I can't help but wonder if it's truly over. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear faint whispers, and I can't shake the feeling that Margaret's promise that she wasn't done with us wasn't just an empty threat. Months passed, and life began to return to a semblance of normalcy for Rachel and me. Mark, however, wasn't the same. Despite surviving the ordeal, he became reclusive, refusing to talk about the asylum or anything related to it. His once vibrant curiosity had turned into a deep-seated fear. One day, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, but I recognized Mark's handwriting on the note inside. It read, "Don't let your guard down." We ended one chapter, but the story isn't over. The entity wasn't destroyed, only delayed. Stay vigilant, and if you ever hear the whispers again, run. The note was accompanied by a set of coordinates. When I entered them into my phone, they pointed to an abandoned church in a remote part of the state. I tried calling Mark, but his number was disconnected. He'd vanished, leaving only the ominous warning behind. Rachel and I debated what to do. Should we follow the coordinates and investigate further? Or should we leave well enough alone? One quiet night, as I lay in bed, I was startled awake by a familiar sound. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then it grew louder, clearer, the unmistakable chilling whispers. "Come back," they murmured, their voices blending into a haunting chorus. I froze, my heart pounding. The room felt colder, the air heavier, and then I saw it, a faint shadow at the corner of my room, just out of reach of the dim light from my bedside lamp. I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone and called Rachel. She answered on the first ring, her voice trembling. "I hear them too," she said. "The asylum may have been destroyed, but its influence lingers. It wasn't just a building or a place. It was a gateway, a tether to something far beyond our comprehension. Rachel and I know the truth now. There's no escaping it. Margaret's whispers were never meant to stop. They were a siren song, a warning, and an invitation all at once. The silent choir may be gone, but the entity they worshipped remains. And as long as it does, so too will the whispers. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, every shadow in the corner of our vision reminds us of the darkness we unleashed. So, if you ever find yourself near the remains of the Ashcroft Asylum, or if you hear faint whispers in the dead of night, heed my warning. Don't listen. Don't follow. Don't stay. Because once you're marked, there's no going back. And that's the story, my friends. A harrowing tale that still sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. I truly hope it kept you on the edge of your seat, as much as it haunted me to relive it while telling it to you. Before we wrap up, I want to take a moment to thank you, yes you, for sticking with me until the very end. Your time and attention mean the world, and it's because of you that we get to share these chilling stories and keep the spirit of storytelling alive. Now, as we close the chapter on this tale, I have one simple request. Let it go. Forget the details. Forget the shadows. Forget the whispers. Leave it here in this space. Don't let it follow you into your world, because some stories are best left behind. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to let us know in the comments. And if you have your own spine-tingling experiences or tales of terror, feel free to share them. We'd love to hear them. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, but most importantly, stay cautious. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Or will we? Goodbye for now, and sweet dreams.